Hey guys, Mr. Wiz here. Welcome back to my channel. As always, I'm very excited that you joined us. If you've been following along with the course, you know a lot. You have learned a lot of things over the course of this series. So, if we think back on it, you've learned about things like building sprites. You learned about overlap codes. So when two sprites touch, what happens, right? You learned about conditionals, if-then blocks that can help you specify exactly what's going to happen in different scenarios. You've learned about projectiles. You've learned about, what else did we learn about? Loops. We did loops. We learned about bouncing, physics, gravity. So by now, you have enough information that you can build a lot of simple games, and I hope you have done that. I hope you have built some games using the skills that you've learned. So going forward now, in this point in the course, this is around the halfway point. Going forward from here, we're still going to be building games. We're still going to be learning about coding, but the things we're doing now is going to be a little bit more advanced, okay? So just a heads up as far as that goes. It's not going to be crazy hard, but we're assuming that all the skills from the previous videos, you've already learned them. So now we are moving on to some fun, slightly more complicated stuff. So in today's video might be a little bit long. We'll see how it comes out. But in today's video, we're actually covering two new ideas that we haven't done yet. We're going to be looking at multiplayer. We're just going to be looking at that a little bit. We're going to be looking at multiplayer, and then we're going to be looking at functions. So functions are the big idea behind today's video. And to learn about functions, I'm going to build a Pong style game. So I would highly encourage that you follow along with me. You pause the video when you need to, because Pong is a very classic game that is very popular in the video gaming world, and it would be great to build your own version of it. So please follow along with me as we go through this, and I'm going to talk to you about what we're doing along the way. So first things first, as always, make sure you're signed in the top right corner there. And I'm going to go ahead and just call it Pong for now. I can always change the name later. So some interesting things about Pong. Some people think, and I'm going to talk while I work, because a lot of stuff I'm doing in the beginning is not new stuff, okay? So some people think that Pong is the first video game. That is incorrect. Pong is not the first video game. But it is probably safe to say that it's the first commercially successful video game, if that makes sense. What do I mean by that? I mean, there were video games before Pong, but none of them did as well in the early days of video gaming as Pong did. So Pong took the world by storm. It really did. It was a two-player game. Sorry. I just want to make sure. There it is. Okay, there's my paddle for my player one. So it was a two-player game that used knobs. So that you would turn the knob and it would go up or down. And you would play against your friends. And it was an arcade game that showed up in a lot of fun places, soda fountain shops, pizza shops, any place that people might hang out. You would see Pong. Oh, yes, I need to move. That's what I was looking for. Move with controls. I'm apparently not very good at talking while I work. All right. There we go. Does it work? Yes, it does, but it goes off the screen. All right, I'm going to keep on going with it. So Pong was a very successful game, but it was not the first video game. In fact, Pong was inspired by a game that existed earlier that was called Ping Pong. And Ping Pong was actually played directly off of a television set. It was one of the pre-programmed games for the Brown Box, which was a prototype designed by Ralph Baer, who designed the first at-home console. It was not commercially available. It was just a prototype, but it inspired, of course, later consoles that came on down the road, such as Atari and Nintendo and all of that. So, yeah, Pong was inspired by a game called Ping Pong, but even Ping Pong was inspired by an earlier game called Tennis for Two, which was played on military equipment that was meant for tracking missiles in the 50s. So, fun little history there. I think I mentioned in the last video, we were talking about designing your own games, how a lot of times your ideas are not completely original. You can be inspired by other games, Pong is a great example of that. Pong was inspired by ping pong, which was inspired by tennis for two, which, if you really think about it, the video game Tennis for Two was inspired by actual tennis. So none of those games were completely unique. So the game we're going to be building is clearly not unique. I'm clearly inspired by the video game Pong, but it's not going to be an exact copy. It's not going to be a ripoff. It's going to be same idea, but with my own code, right? So here I have player one. Let's go ahead and talk about what we're building. So I've got player one. He moves up and down because I gave him movement in the Y direction, but not in the X direction. So if he moved left and right, it would make for a weird game. So I only have him moving up and down. Now he has a speed of 100, which is a little bit slow. I could always change that if I wanted to. What does 150 feel like? For me, that feels better. But of course, you can decide what speed works for you. So I have him on the left side of the screen. Everything looks good here. It is time for me to do my player two, right? So here's where you might run into problems. So I'm going to go ahead and create my player two. I'll make him blue. And I'm going to do pretty much the same stuff I did with the other guy. I think I made him 4 pixels thick. So let's go with 4 again. Oop, I should be using the line tool. Why am I not using the line tool? There we go. And so I'm making him 4 pixels thick. I'm putting him on the right-hand side. I'm going to set his position. Make sure you're careful with the names. And the right-hand side of the screen is 160. All right. And I'm going to have him stay in the screen as well. So for the most part, you'll see that my player 2 controls, I'm coding the same way I did the player 1 controls. So here's where I'm going to run into problems. If I put the move with button controls and I do them the same way I did player 1, the computer right now doesn't understand that there's a difference between player 1 and player 2 because I gave them both the same code. I gave them both move with buttons. So if I try to play this game and I use my buttons, they're both moving. I'm both players at the same time, which is not what I want. I want there to be 2 separate players. So how do I code that in MakeCode Arcade? Well, in the controller section, if you go down below the move with button stuff here, there is a multiplayer section down here where you can actually do up to 4 players. You can actually build up to 4-player games with MakeCode Arcade. So really, where it says player 2 is what I want. So instead of doing the regular move with buttons, which I have already, I'm going to use the player 2 move, and I have to put the correct name of the sprite there. And now I give them the correct controls. So I'll put the VX to 0, and I'll use 150 because I feel like it's a little bit better controls. So now when I go to play the game, player 2 should move my sprite 2, and player 1 should move my sprite. So here we go, player 1. Yep. So what controls are player 2? Well, if you click on the little keyboard icon down here at the bottom, it'll actually show you the controls. So player 1 plays with either arrow keys or WASD keys. Player 2 plays with I, K, J, and L. And then the buttons U and O if there's an A, B option. For this game, we're just using up and down. So I and K is what player 2 is going to use. So if I use WS for player 1 on the left side of my keyboard, and I can use IK for player 2 on the right side of my keyboard. So this allows 2 people to play the game on the same computer. You can both be huddled around the same keyboard and play the game together. All right, so we've got controls, and we have our first experience with multiplayer controls. So now let's go ahead and get back to building the game. So of course, we will need to have a ball, and it will need to have some bouncing abilities to bounce off the paddles and so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and create our ball sprite now. And you know what? I'm tired of seeing all these my sprite 2, my sprite 3. So let's go ahead and rename them. So I'm going to rename my sprite. I'm choosing rename. I'm not choosing new variable. That's important. So if I give it a new variable, then I have to go back afterwards and have to change all these to match it. But if I just rename it, then there will no longer be something called my sprite. So I'm just going to call it player 1, no spaces. And I'm going to call my sprite 2. I'm going to rename it as player 2. And then for this new thing that I'm creating, I'm going to rename it as ball. All right. So let's go ahead and grab a picture for that. I'm just going to grab one from the gallery here because there are some ball images at the bottom. So we'll just grab one of these. So I've got the ball, which should appear in the middle of the screen. That's great. It will need to move. So now, in fairness, to keep this game fair, it could either move left or it could move right. So I should probably decide which way I want it to move. But if I really want to be fair, it should be random, shouldn't it? So let's go ahead and give it a random velocity. So I'm going to set the ball's velocity in the x direction to a random number. I'm trying to think about how I want to do this. Do I want the speed to be random, or do I just want the direction to be random? I'm thinking I just want the direction to be random. I probably want the speed to be the same either way. So probably before I do this, before I set its velocity, I need to do something similar to a coin toss that they would do in a sports game, right? So if you're playing football or something like that, there's a coin toss to decide who gets the ball first. I think we should do something like that here. So a coin toss is 50-50. It's either heads or tails, right? So before we give it a direction and a speed, let's use randomness in the math section. And let's create a variable. And you know what? I'm just going to call this variable coin toss. One word, capital T for toss. So I'm going to set the coin toss to, and I'm going to pick between 0 and 1. So it's going to randomly pick either 0 or 1 for the coin toss. Then I will have to use a logic, an if condition, to decide which way the ball goes. So if, and I'm just going to go ahead and put, like I said, I'm not doing a lot of talking right now because this is not our first time using these tools. So hopefully you are already familiar with them. So if coin toss equals 0, let's just make it go left. So if coin toss equals 0, then it will be moving in the negative x direction. And I'll have to decide what speed to make the ball. I haven't really decided that yet. Let's just do 50 for now. And then I'll use the plus sign here to say else. So else, of course, is anything other than 0, which in this case is just 1, right? So if the coin toss equals 0, it'll go to the left, or else it will go to the right, which we'll say is positive 50. So let's take a look at the game so far. That's not bad. Let's refresh it here. The ball could probably afford to be a little bit faster, but for now, I'll just leave it this way until I actually start playing it, and we can decide if we like the speed or not. Okay, so obviously you saw that the ball hits the paddle and goes straight through the paddle, so we do need to create the bouncing physics for the paddle. So let's go ahead and get started with that. So here we're talking about overlap codes. It's been a little while since we've used overlap codes, but whenever you're talking about two sprites touching, this is what we were talking about, right? So let's grab this overlap code. So when the player overlaps with kind player, well, we shouldn't have the players and the ball. They shouldn't all be set to player, right? So let's come up with a new kind for the ball. We could use one of the pre-made kinds here. Actually, projectile would kind of fit because it is a moving object. So I'm just going to set the ball to a projectile kind. All right. So So we're going to change our overlap code for when the player overlaps with a projectile. So when the paddle, which is the player, overlaps with a projectile, which is the ball, what do we want to happen? Well, we want that projectile to bounce, right? Now, which way do we want to bounce? Which direction are we talking about bouncing it? We're talking about bouncing it in left or right. We're talking about bouncing it in the x direction, right? So if you remember from our physics lesson on bouncing basically just means we're changing the direction of its velocity, right? So what I need to do is I need to grab a set velocity x, and this is very similar to the math formula we used in the bouncing lesson. I'm going to set its velocity x to its current velocity. Its current velocity x times -1. Remember when we did that in the bouncing lesson? So if it's moving right and it hits the paddle, it should bounce and change directions and move left. If it's moving left and it hits the paddle, it should bounce, change directions, and go right. And the best way to change that direction is to just multiply the number by -1. So if it's moving in a positive direction, it'll switch to negative. If it's moving in the negative direction, it will switch to positive. All right, so of course I need to change these names. So what I'm going to do here, I could just put ball here since there is only one ball on the screen. But what if at some point in time I decide to improve my game and give it a multi-ball scenario or something like that? So what I'm going to do is instead of putting ball there, I'm going to grab where it says other sprite. Remember our temporary variables? Other sprite in this scenario represents the projectile. So when a sprite that is a player overlaps with another sprite, which is a projectile, we're going to change the other sprite's velocity to the velocity times -1. There we go. And if you look, the ball is now bouncing back and forth. So it looks like we have the beginning of a game here. All right. So right now it's just going left and right, kind of a boring game. We need to start bouncing up and down too. So normally to do that, I would have to knock it up. So I'd have to do something like that. But you'll notice when I hit it, whether it's up or down, the ball doesn't move up or down. It's still only worried about left and right. So we're going to add some addition to our scenario here so that if I hit the ball while moving up or down, I'm going to add momentum to the ball so that it goes up or down. So here we're going to need to do that addition. When it overlaps, we're going to have to change the VY, right? Now this is going to be dependent on which player it hits, I think. Will it? Let's see what happens. All right, so let's set the ball, which is the other sprite. Let's set its VY, and I'm just going to just to save myself time, I'm just going to copy this, duplicate, put that in here. Oop, I did it wrong. There we go. So I'm going to set its VY to whatever its old VY was, plus the VY of the player. My head's in the way. Which, you know what? There's two players. So once again, I shouldn't put player 1 or player 2. I should use the sprite bubble here. All right. So basically what I'm saying is that when a paddle hits the ball's Vx will switch directions, and the ball's Vy will be equal to its old Vy plus the velocity of the paddle that it hit. This should work, I think. Let's try it. My head keeps getting in the way. All right. Does it work? If I hit it up, it goes up. Hey, you saw that. It worked. If I hit it down, does it go down? Yes. All right. So that looks like the paddle part is working correctly. Now, the problem, of course, is that the ball left the screen. So now I need to come up with some bouncing for the top and the bottom of the screen. As I mentioned, this is going to be a little bit of a long video, but I hope you're following along. I hope you're pausing when necessary. All right, so we need to come up with a scenario. So when the ball hits the top of the screen, it bounces off the top. And if it hits the bottom of the screen, it bounces off the bottom. Well, this is starting to sound a lot like that basketball program we made when we were learning about gravity. Because remember how we had the player stop when he hit the floor? Well, it's going to be something similar to that, except instead of stopping, we need it to bounce. So what I really need is for the program to be constantly checking the position of the ball and noticing if it gets too high or too low, that the ball changes directions, that it bounces. So we're going to need to use an on-game update for that. On-game update. Remember, on-game update checks at every frame, so it checks frequently. And I need it to check for the position of the ball. On-game update. If, and I got to grab some of this stuff, and I'm not going to walk you through every single step here because this is very similar to stuff we've done before. If the ball's X position is, I'm going to do less than or equal to 0. And you know what? I shouldn't do X position. I should do the top of the ball. So if the top of the ball is less than or equal to 0, which means that it's at the top of the screen, right? Because that's where y equals 0. Then I need it to bounce. But I also need it to bounce at the bottom. So I should add to this an or. Remember the ors? So and means they both have to be true, or means only one has to be true. So let's change this up a little bit with a nice or. So if the top of the ball is less than 0, or the bottom of the ball is greater than or equal to, remember the height of the screen is 120. So if the top of the ball is less than or equal to 0, or the bottom of the ball is greater than or equal to 120, then I need the ball to bounce, right? So then I need, now we're bouncing up or down, so this is the y direction we're talking about, right? So I want to change the Vy, and it's going to be very similar to what we did here. We're multiplying by -1. So actually, I'll just drag it down here, make it easier for myself. All right. So if the top of the ball is less than or equal to 0, or the bottom of the ball is greater than or equal to 120, then the ball's velocity in the y direction will change directions. It'll be multiplied by -1. So if it's moving up, it should now move down. And if it was moving down, it should now move up. And this should work in both directions. Let's test it. Whenever you're coding, it's a good idea to regularly test your games to see if they're working correctly. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and knock it up and see if it bounces off the ceiling. Oop, I missed it. I missed the ball. It's going so slow and I missed it. Let's try that again. There it is. Oh, a little buggy. A little bit buggy. Oh, it worked that time. All right, so it is bouncing, just a little buggy. We know I need to work on those bugs later, but let's just go ahead and move on for now and say that it's working. I wonder if it would work better if I just used y instead of top and bottom. Let's just see. Does it work better if I just use y? Oof, that was... Well, it does seem to be less buggy. All right, that's not terrible. I guess I could leave it that way. Okay, well, the other way should have technically worked, but this way seems to be less buggy, so I'll leave it this way for now. So this seems to be working pretty good. It is bouncing off the top and the bottom. We do still have a few more additions to make. For instance, we do need to create a way to get points, right? But more importantly, we need to create a way to make another ball. We can't have the game play with only one ball. That would be a very fast, very short, very boring game, really. So we need there to be a way to earn more balls in this game. So here's where we're moving on to the second big idea for this video, functions. So right here, we've already created the code to make a ball right here, where it creates a ball, and it picks a direction, and it shoots the ball in that direction. So we already have blocks here for making a ball, but we need this to happen more than once. In fact, we need it to happen a couple times. So let's go ahead and start working on our second update. We're going to need another thing that's checking for the X position and the Y position. When the ball's X is less than or equal to 0, which means it's going past the red player, when that happens, I'm not going to use the or anymore. I'm getting rid of the or. When the ball gets past the red player, when its X position is less than or equal to 0, player 2 should be getting a point. So by the way, you will see if you go to the game section. Oh, wait, it's not game section. It's info. I told you the wrong thing. In info, we have points. We've used points before up here in the top. But since we're doing a multiplayer game now, if you scroll down to the bottom, there are more options here for multiplayer points. So what we're going to do is we're going to change player 2's score. Oh, that's life. I need the one for score. We're going to change player 2's score by 1. So if the ball gets past the red paddle, if its X is less than or equal to 0, player 2's score will change by 1. And I'm going to duplicate this. and say that if the X position is greater than or equal to, and the far right side of the screen, do you guys remember that number? It was 160. So if the player's X position is greater than or equal to 160, then we're going to change player 1's score. I don't know why I just deleted that. I could have just edited it. Change player 1's score by 1. All right, cool. But that's not all we need it to do. But let's just see if it works. Let's just test it out. So I'm going to try to score on player 2 here and get player 1 a point. Yep, although it looks like we got an infinite number of points. Why do we have an infinite number of points? Because guess where the ball is? It's still past the blue player. So in addition to doing that, I also need it to destroy the ball. So let's go ahead and grab a destroy block there. Destroy the ball. And now we're going to create a new ball. So to do that, we're going to go ahead and start talking about functions. A function is essentially a shortcut. It's something we would use when you're using the same bit of code more than once, right? So a phrase that I like to use in my classes is that a good coder is a lazy coder, because we're always looking for shortcuts. So this is basically the idea. This bit of code that we've already created works great at creating a ball. But what we need it to happen again. If the ball gets past one of these players, we're going to give them a point, and then we need it to create another ball. So the same bit of code we're actually going to need in 3 different places. We're going to need it here, we're going to need it when player 1 gets a point, and we're going to need it when player 2 gets a point. So I could literally put those same blocks of code in here and there, and that would be fine. But to simplify my program, I'm going to use a function. So let's get started on that. So in the advanced section, we're looking at advanced. In the advanced section, there's functions right here. So we're going to make a function, and whenever you make a function, it's a good idea to name it whatever you're using it for. So in this case, I'm going to name it create ball, and I'm going to capitalize each word so it's easy to read. So I'm making a function called create ball. Inside of this function, all I'm going to do, make my life easier, is I'm just going to take these blocks that created the ball, and I'm going to put them inside that function. So now whenever I need to create a ball, all I have to do is run this function again. Now, right now, my game's broken. The game's broken because it's looking for a ball that doesn't exist. So here's a big idea. Here's a big thing to know when it comes to functions. Creating a function is not the same thing as using a function. So I took the code that was working correctly, I put it inside of this function called create ball, but my game suddenly stopped working correctly. It stopped working correctly because my onStart block no longer has a ball in it. I need it to create the ball. I've created the function, but I'm not using the function. To show you what I mean, we're going to go ahead and fix this. To use the function, I have to go back to the function section, and I have to grab this block that says call. So call, in this case, my function create ball. So if you have multiple functions, this is why it's a good idea to name them according to what they do. So I want to call the function that's called create ball. Now my game will start working again just like it was before. Basically, my game is doing the exact same code it did before. It created player 1, then it created player 2, and then it went to this block that says call create ball, and it skipped over here, and it did these blocks, which is the same blocks it was doing before. So my game is technically the exact same as it was before I made this function. But the reason I made the function was to make my life easier for this next part. Now down here, instead of creating the code all over again, I just go to function, and I put call create ball. So after it destroys the old ball, I need it to create a new one. And I'll do the same thing. I can just duplicate this block right here. So after it destroys the old ball, it's going to create a new one. Let's test it out, see how it works. All right. Boom. And I was right. It did fix the other problem. So that other bug was fixed after we did this. Now, there are still some bugs that we might need to work out. As you can tell when you play it, it's not perfect, but we've got ourselves a Pong game, a working, playable Pong game. Congratulations, guys. Also a 2-player Pong game, so you can now play with your friends. Okay, Is there anything else you could change about this? Absolutely. You might decide to add some sound effects. You might try to fix some of those bugs we were looking at earlier, right? Or you might decide to do something a little bit more wild and creative with it. Get creative with it. Maybe create a cool background for it. That'd be nice. Have fun building this out and making it your own. I cannot wait to see what you guys end up doing with this. There's a lot of creativity you could do. Oh, you know what you should do? You should build an ending to the game, because right now there's no ending to the game. So maybe inside of our on-game update block, you could have something like if player one score equals, whatever number you decide to give it, right? Maybe you win when you get 15 points. So you could do an if player one score equals 15. You could do a special win message for player one. You could do a different win message for win player two, something like that. That'd be kind of fun. You should remember how to build all that stuff. We've talked about editing game overs right here. There's a lot of options there to use logic and all of that. So have fun. Build out your Pong game. Get creative with it. Don't forget to give instructions at the beginning of the game to let people know how to play your game. And once you've made your Pong game, please share it in the comments of this video. I want to see what you guys made. I want to play it. So that's all for now. This has probably been a long enough video. If you are not already subscribed, please subscribe. Don't forget to tell your friends and family about this channel and to definitely share your games with them as well as me. Until next time, have a great rest of your day.